no walking away, nah. And giving up but without a fight, no walking away, nah. You and I are in this for life.
मैं थोड़ी तेजा वो थोड़ा पौड़ा लाइफ कट्ठियां बताउणी साडा गोला हुंदे लेखां च नी वाइस मुंडे सब दे I'm glad कि जट मेरा कोला मैं थोड़ी तेजा ते ओह बोला लाइफ कट्ठियां बताउणी साडा गोला हुंदे लेखां च नी वाइस मुंडे सब दे I'm glad कि जट मेरा कोला मैं चुप करां ना ते ओह नी बोलदा कदे कदे मेरी गल भी नहीं खोलदा 100 करदी तां इक मसा चकदा कट दिंदा ए जवाब मेरी कॉल दा मैं थोड़ी स्वीट आ ते ओह रूड़ा गल करे या ना करे ओहदा मूड़ा मैनू पता आ मैं ओनू ठीक कर लूं जट्टी हौसले च तां भी और घोड़ा
There's nothing to do about it, I can't stop it. You got me out of my mind, all out of pocket. Oh, you the king, I'm the one. But the things that you done, better make it up to me because I'm mad. Still I love you till my last day. So baby, please don't make me wait in vain. Found my strength now, but you my weakness. Still I'm glad that you came my way.
नेड़े दिल दे घट मिलदे लोक सुनिया ताइयों कदर करा कदी तां आवेगा समझ जावेगा गल लावेगा ताइयों सबर करा तेरे वर्गी तू आखदा दुनिया बथेरी फिरदी ओ तेरे जइए पर तू नहीं ताइयों तेरे मगर फिरा वे ताइयों तेरे मगर फिरा
Yeah, I'm thugging, I body everything you're not with. You want it, you got it, anything for you, babe. I'm the rose, you the gun, get the ring, I'm the one. Ain't no one better for you, you know I'm bad. They say we're crazy, we'll never make it, but they don't know us. There's no you if there's no me, ain't no faking this. We got that energy, I want you close to me, yeah.
मैं थोड़ी होटा थोड़ा कूला लड़ पैनिया दिमाग मेरा फूला नीओ करता बिलीव रिस्पेक्ट च मुंडा सोचनी तो जमा ओल्ड स्कूल मैं थोड़ी सॉफ्टा वो थोड़ा हाड़ा रहंदा खिजदा ही करदा ना लाड़ा दिंदा देखने किसे नू मेरे वल ना इंज करे जो बहेव मेरा गाड़ा मैं थोड़ी आमा मशहूरा पर भोरा भी ना करदा जरूरा ਚੱਕਾ ਹੋਰ ਨਾ ਗਰੰਟੀ ਗੁੱਸੇ ਵਾਲੇ ਦੀ ਬਸ ਕੁੜੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਨਸ਼ਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਦੂਰ ਨੀ ਬਸ ਕੁੜੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਨਸ਼ਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਦੂਰ ਕੁੜੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਨਸ਼ਿਆਂ ਤੋਂ ਦੂਰ
No walking away, nah, nah. And giving up but without a fight. No walking away, nah, nah. You and I are in this for life.
ਸਤਿ ਸ਼੍ਰੀ ਅਕਾਲ ਜੀ ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਆਪਣਾ ਸਿੱਧੂ ਮੂਸੇਵਾਲਾ ਜੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਗਾਣਾ ਵਧੀਆ ਲੱਗਿਆ ਤਾਂ ਸਬਸਕ੍ਰਾਈਬ ਕਰ ਲਓ ਅਫੀਸ਼ੀਅਲ YouTube ਚੈਨਲ ਸਿੱਧੂ ਮੂਸੇਵਾਲਾ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਬਹੁਤ ਘੈਂਟ ਕੰਟੈਂਟ ਆਉਂਦਾ ਹੋਇਆ
Nah, nah. You and I are in this for life.
Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon for your daily dose of sugar.
Hi guys, this is Shohini Chanda and today I'm going to create this beautiful glam look and I will also share how I contour my face. So if you guys are interested then please keep on watching. I'm going to start off with my base and the first thing I'm using is a primer and this is the Aquaholic Priming Moisturizer. It is a very good priming moisturizer and I'm going to apply this all over my face. Next up I'm going to use the Sugar Bling Leader Illuminating Moisturizer in the shade 01 Gold Digging and I'm also going to apply this all over my face. You can use it on the highest points but I love using this all over my face. Now as I do have little bit of scars from acne and the cut I got recently, I'm going to color correct and for that I'm using the Face Forward stick in the shade Peach. for my foundation, I'm using the Ace of Base foundation stick. This is a very good high coverage foundation stick, and the shade I'm using is 35 Frappe. Now this shade matches me perfectly, and I'm using a beauty blender to blend out the shade. Alright, it's time for contour and highlight, and the product I will be using for my contour is the Face Forward stick in the shade 01. Now what you have to do is just follow the shadows of your own face shape. I am going to apply the contour on my cheekbones. Now just make it little upward as you want to lift your face and make it more chiseled. Now I'm also going to apply this on my jawline to define my jaw, and lastly I will also apply it on my forehead and also on my nose to make it more sharp. Now to highlight my face, I'm using the Sugar Magic Wand Concealer in the shade number 30. I am going to apply this on my under eyes, forehead, chin, cupid's bow, nose and also under my cheekbones. To blend further, you can use a brush or a sponge. I love using a sponge because it gives more natural finish. Now to bake my face, I'm using the Sugar Translucent Powder in the shade Banana. I'm going to bake my under eyes, nose, around my mouth and under my cheekbones. Now I am going to let it sit for a few minutes, and I'm going to do my brows off camera. After that, I am going to dust off all the baking powder I have on my face with a powder brush. Next, I'm going to use this Contour de Force Mini Bronzer in the shade 02 Woody Wonder, and I'm going to apply this on my cheekbones as well as on my jaw, forehead and my nose. And for my blush, I'm using the shade Salmon Superstar, and it's a beautiful blush, you guys. I absolutely love this one. Now I'm going to set my face using the setting spray. This is the highlighter one, and I'm just going to apply this all over my face and let it sit for a few minutes. Next, I'm going to use this jelly highlighter in the shade 01, which is gold, and it's a beautiful highlighter, you guys. I am going to apply this all over my highest points of my face. It's time for my eye makeup, and I'm using the Blend the Rules eyeshadow palette in the shade Flawless, and I'm going to take this shade on my crease with a fluffy blending brush, and I'm just going to blend it very nicely as a transition shade. Next up, I'm going to take this beautiful Rusty over my crease again with a small blending brush, and I'm just going to blend it very nicely. Now I'm going to use the Sugar Eyes and Shine Shadow Crayon in the shade 07 Turquoise, and I'm going to apply this all over my eyelid, and with a blending brush I'm just going to blend it on my crease. Now to finish off the eye makeup, I am going to use a mascara here, and I'm also going to top it off with a falsies. And finally, for my lipstick, I'm using the Matte as Hell Lip Crayon in the shade 19 Emma Woodhouse, and I am going to top it off with the same burnt orange shade from the shadow palette. So with that, I am going to finish off this look. I hope you guys like it, and let me know in the comment section below if you guys like it or not, and give this video a big thumbs up. I hope to see you guys very soon. Till then, take care. I love you all. Bye.
Oh wait, while you were at it, don't forget to participate in our contest. Head on to the video that you're seeing on screen right now, answer a simple question over there, and you will get a chance to win some exciting sugar products. Good luck! On screen right now, answer a simple question over there, and you will get a chance to win some exciting sugar products.
The IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva spoke about the boost in resources with Bloomberg's David Weston.
The most important message of our proposal is a coordinated effort upfront can bring enormous benefits. Between now and 2025, the world economy can benefit $1 trillion if we accelerate the exit from the pandemic, of which 60% will go to the developing world, 40% to rich countries. And for those who may be still hesitant, is this a good plan? Advanced economies, rich countries, can collect $1 trillion in extra budgetary revenues through taxes because we accelerate the recovery everywhere. And that is, at this point of time, the best use of public money one can think of.
Well, joining us to talk about all of this is the Nobel laureate Michael Spence. He's chairman at the General Atlantic Global Growth Institute. Professor Spence, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're spending quite a lot of time looking at, an equitable recovery and actually some of the things that need to be put in place to make it fairer for everyone. Through your research on productivity and what kind of recovery we'll see, what are the foundations that politicians need to lay now to make sure that it does get better for everyone?
Well, there's short-term, Francine, and the long-term. So short-term, it really, on a global basis comes down to vaccines because that's what enables the recovery. It's what enables the recovery of the sectors that were suppressed, which tend to be, heavy employers in the lower income ranges. So I think, the agenda is pretty clear, and the president of the IMF, the managing director, is absolutely right. I mean, my estimate is that this is going to take us through 2022 if everybody sort of pitches in and works on it. After that, I mean, I think, we've got, depending on where you are, a major inequality problem. The Biden administration has their own proposals for dealing with it, other than buffering the shock of the pandemic as it comes to an end in America, and we'll see similar things in Europe. But then I think the question is, can we deal with the sort of, employment challenges, skills, all those things, infrastructure, giving everybody access to the internet, at reasonable bandwidth speeds and so on. So I mean, it's a big agenda, but the good news is, I think right now is that people are taking it, politicians and policymakers are taking it seriously. And so I'm kind of it's a big challenge, but I'm optimistic.
But when you look at some of the technological transformations, I know, again, you've done a lot of work of that. How many jobs are going to be lost because of it? I know we're creating some thanks to sustainability or, the new ESG jobs, but actually, are we ready for this huge transformation?
No, we're not. I mean, we're almost inevitably going to fall behind. I've seen estimates that are, from people who do serious research, sort of bottom-up, microeconomic level, that the automation version of this, could be 60% of the digital transformation. Yeah, that means basically that, lots of jobs are going to disappear, and they have to be replaced. So I think, one of the things that people have started to understand is that the demand side of the economy is important. If you're going to replace jobs, you have to have demand, and that is also related to the income distribution question. I mean, if almost all if we have a productivity boom, for example, and almost all the incremental income goes to the top end of the income distribution or the owners of capital, we will have a demand problem, and that will turn into an employment problem when we're trying to replace jobs that have been taken out by digital automation.
Michael, it's Kaylee speaking to you from here in New York. And here in the U.S., the Biden administration is trying to push its infrastructure spending as a jobs plan. But there's a huge debate going on what exactly defines infrastructure, how much we should be spending on it. From your point of view, to drive growth and equitable growth going forward, where do investments need to be made?
I would say, Kaylee, across the board. I mean, some of it is physical infrastructure. Some of it is sort of, digital infrastructure, if I can put it that way, of an inclusive kind. Get everybody in one way or another on the network. This, by the way, is not a job that the federal government could do alone, but they can make a big difference. But then there's the sort of soft, what's sometimes called soft infrastructure. It's kind of human capital, what economists call human capital. I think we should find a new word for this, but basically it's education and skills training and that sort of thing. And then there's for the dynamism of the economy and creating new sectors, whether they're digital or health and biomedical science or even the energy transformation and dealing with climate change, we've got to invest in the science and technology of that, and the government has a pretty important role in the upstream part of that. So I guess the short answer is all of the above.
Okay, but then of course that would come with a pretty large price tag, and the pushback on that from the other side of the aisle is that that's just going to cause inflation. Do you agree?
Well, you spend a lot of time talking about this, but so the question is, do we have the right mix of fiscal and monetary policy? So my take on that is that we had excessive reliance on monetary policy and too little on fiscal coming out of the great financial crisis. Now we've got sort of everybody all in, right? Because the federal government is trying, at least in the United States, is trying to be, is pushing pretty hard on the fiscal side, and the central bank is still pretty aggressive and kind of outcome based, as many of your commentators say. So, so there is inflationary concerns. But I think the challenge here is to find a better balance between the fiscal and the monetary side. And by the way,
so how do you do that?
Well,
but Professor, how do you do that without having an economy that actually overheats?
Well, you pull back on the monetary side and at a measured pace, with a big fiscal program pushing the economy and the demand side of the economy along. At least, I think it's the general sort of direction that you go. Some people think you should pull back on the fiscal side. There is a debate going on about whether this is just way too big. And I don't think that's been settled. I think a sensible infrastructure plan that's 10 years, it runs out 10 years. These are long-term investments that we're making is doable. But I think, probably the time has come for the central banks to think that they've kind of done their job. And it would help, actually, if people had real interest rates that were positive on their savings.
Professor, how does the relationship between the U.S. and China actually, change or continually changes the composition of the U.S. economy?
Well, I think, China is going through a set of transformations that are somewhat similar to what the rest of us are going through. And we know, especially around the digital area, but in technology generally, that there are tensions because,
Professor, how does the relationship between the U.S. and China
well, for a lot of reasons, national security, who owns the intellectual property, how are we going to regulate the internet, etc. But on the whole, I think that if you look at the future and this starting point, I think that sensible people on both sides can find ways to cooperate in areas where it's really beneficial, like health and climate change. And we'll just have to live with the tensions otherwise.
Michael, let's talk about another region of the world where you're joining us from. In Europe, obviously the recovery seems to be picking up steam, but they are still behind. At what point are we going to see Europe catch up, or will we?
So we're behind because of the vaccines, but we're in that sense catching up fairly fast, which means we're returning to some version of European normal. But that is, unless there's some fairly fundamental changes made in Europe, that's slower growth than we'll see in the United States or in China and Asia in general. So, I'm just trying to calibrate it, so we're going to catch up, and return to some version of normal. But our normal here is still relatively slower growth and relatively slower productivity growth because there are structural reasons for that.
Thank you so much, Michael Spencer, chairman at the General Atlantic Global Growth Institute. Now, coming up, Belarus accused of hijacking after forcing a plane to land in order to make an arrest. We'll discuss the international response shortly. This is Bloomberg.
our generation's biggest problem,
Climate change is happening.
and the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
BSO Now is your online home for weekly Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. See new concerts that go behind the scenes, plus acclaimed archival concerts. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsor, Bank of America.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York with Francine Lacqua in London. Matt Miller is off today. Well, Francine, Europe and the United States have reacted with outrage after Belarus ordered a Ryanair flight to land and arrested a journalist on board. Roman Pratsevich had covered protests against President Alexander Lukashenko last year. Bloomberg's Alexander Krutitsky joins us now from Minsk. Alexander, obviously there are already existing sanctions on Belarus, so what could any kind of retaliatory action from the U.S. or Europe actually look like?
Well, it remains to be seen what kind of retaliative action Europe and the West in general is ready for to address this incident. As I understand, it will be discussed during the European Union summit, which begins today. The previous bout of complicated relations between Lukashenko and the West, he has always been eventually ready for some kind of compromise, but it remains to be seen if this round of deterioration ends in negotiation at all, if he's ready for it. It's an open question.
Alexandra, what does Vladimir Putin or what does the Kremlin do right now?
Sorry, could you repeat this, please? The connection is quite bad.
Yeah, the question is, what does Russia do next?
What will Russia do next? Russia has been supportive with Lukashenko quite firmly in the past years and especially in the past months since his disputed re-election. And from the comments which we start to get, looks like the support will continue. Russia appears willing to support the position of Belarus regarding Ryanair incident.
Does that mean we could actually see relations between Russia and Western countries worsen off the back of this?
I've seen comments from your sources saying that it will unlikely complicate relations between the United States and Russia, especially in the light of what Putin and Joe Biden preparing to have a meeting. It remains to be seen what the West is willing to do to punish Lukashenko for this incident, which is still an open question. It's still being discussed.
Yeah, Alexander, thanks so much. Alexander Krutitsky there for us. Now, coming up in the next hour, we'll discuss more of the European response with Carl Bildt, co-chair for the European Council on Foreign Relations. That's at 6 a.m. in New York, 11 a.m. in London, and this is Bloomberg.
it's really a reminder, isn't it, just how sensitive the markets are to any commentary about trade. We did see some pressure on the yuan, we did see some pressure on the futures. That is now being reversed.
I think actually Comcast has the best hedge because they've got a big foot in distribution and a very big foot in programming with Universal and NBC. And they've got a route to market that's flawless. And by the way, they've had the most sane strategy, I think, in terms of trying to compete with Netflix.
Barry Diller there, the IAC and Expedia Group chairman, speaking with Bloomberg's David Weston from his $260 million Little Island Park in New York City. Now we're joined by Tom Keene, co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance. He doesn't have a theme park yet, but I know he's looking at the Fed and a housing boom. Tom, good morning and happy Monday.
Well, one of the indicators of the recovery here in the boom economy that we're in, we're going to lead with Michael Dart at the 6 a.m. hour, Wall Street Time, Francine, to talk about this boom. He's got some very strong opinions about it. The data shows the up. But what's interesting is the underlying data, whether it's Mr. Diller and a private island or it's real estate with a leg up. This is lagging data. Case-Shiller, out I believe today or tomorrow, lags a good 60 days. But there's the leg up as we've seen in 2007 and on back as well. Higher housing prices. I believe you have that in the United Kingdom as well, Francine.
Yeah, and I have to say, we saw some, the roaring economy back in last month here in the UK as soon as things reopened. But I guess the million-dollar question, Tom, is that, whether we have variants or whether then we go into the summer months and things, quieten down a bit, does that recovery continue? And that is what will lead to inflation or not?
Well, that's one of the theories. The most important essay of the weekend was David Rosenberg was out really pushing against simplistic analysis of inflation. He's in the camp where, yes, we'll see higher inflation, and then we'll come right back down to something fairly normal. That's just one opinion that's out there. What I would notice, Francine, is anecdotally, the rapidity of the reopen is really something to see in New York City.
Right.
It is
and I guess, Tom,
stunning.
It's about jobs, right? If you can't find the right people to fill the jobs, then that will push wage inflation higher, right?
No, it's on a Monday. That's not the angle I was going. We had Daniel Boulud on, and he's opening a hugely fancy restaurant at Grand Central Station, and it's about Francine. You got to come over here, Francine. It's Oysters Vanderbilt at Le Pavillon, and that just says Francine Lacroix.
Does it? Yeah, especially post-pandemic, Tom. Look, let's see whether they reopen the channel. You could come to London. I think you have to take about,
we're waiting. Bags are packed. I'm bringing the dogs.
Okay, perfect. Tom Keene, co-anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance, joining us there, and he'll be on with Lisa Abramowitz and Jonathan Farrow very shortly. Now, here's a look at what else we're watching. Kaylee, I know you're all over the crypto story.
All over it. I honestly wonder if a day will come, Francine, where I'm not going to be watching crypto, because it seems like I'm doing it every single day these days. But today is the start of the CoinDesk Consensus Conference, and there are some big hitters that are going to be talking. Fed Governor Lael Brainerd, Ray Dalio, the Bridgewater Associates founder. These are, important people that markets pay a lot of attention to, so it will be interesting to see what exactly their commentary is like. I'm especially interested in what Brainerd's going to say, considering the warnings we have gotten around crypto from not just the Fed, but really several central banks across the world. So that commentary will be interesting. And of course, it may be a catalyst, because at this point in time, Francine, it seems like any kind of catalyst has the ability to send Bitcoin swinging wildly.
Yeah, catalyst, and actually we just need to try and figure out what the underlying basis for any kind of movement, whether it be up or down, for Bitcoin, and that's probably the big question that we're trying to figure out. It can't only be Elon Musk's tweet to move it. Now, what I'm looking at, I don't know whether they'll talk about Bitcoin, maybe at the margins, is EU leaders gathering for a summit. Now, the focus, first of all, it's in person, Kaylee, so that's, I'm sure, quite exciting for a lot of the leaders. They're meeting in Brussels. They were meant to focus on greenhouse gas emissions, on how to cut them, and actually have a more cohesive approach on sustainability, given what we saw with the recovery fund. I imagine that a lot of the discussions will actually be on Belarus and on Russia and what to do with that pretty shocking news that happened yesterday that really also took Ryanair by surprise, now forcing a lot of companies to also not go through Belarus. You know, the airspace. I'm lost for words just because of this unprecedented violation of European air travel protocols and how leaders will actually deal with that. So they have that to talk about. They also have vaccinations and whether we'll see a passport for example, vaccination Americans, whether they'll give the blueprint for Americans to come over for the summer months.
And whether or not Ireland is going to implement that by early July. But speaking of Ireland, it of course was an Irish airliner, Ryanair, that was involved in the situation in Belarus. And we did just get an updated statement from them, Francine. Ryanair saying they condemn the unlawful actions by Belarusian authorities and that they are cooperating with EU safety and security agencies as well as NATO. So, of course, we will be following that story throughout the day, Francine.
Yeah, we certainly will. The U.S. also strongly condemning the forced diversion of this flight between two EU member states. Whether they'll do something about it is really what people are watching out for. Now, coming up in the next hour, Michael Darda, MKM Partners chief economist and market strategist. I know Tom and John and Lisa will have a question or two about inflation. Tom bringing us that note not to be oversimplistic about the roaring economy being back. So they'll look at probably 5 years and what's going on in Michigan. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Economists and everyone, companies are having a really difficult time keeping up with how fast fundamentals are improving.
What we're seeing in the U.S. is just a very rapid rebound in demand, and supply is taking a little bit of time to adjust.
If the economy stays as strong as it is,
fueled by all of the stimulus that was put behind it, you get inflation.
We see a decent amount of risk that inflation could keep rising. It's already rising, but stay higher for longer.
The Fed's strategy at the moment is really focused on ambiguity.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowitz.
Bouncing back this morning from New York City for our audience worldwide. Good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Equity futures up 21 on the S&P 500. We advanced 0.5%. We have to begin this program, Tom, in a way that I don't think we've ever started a show, by talking about the forced landing of a Ryanair flight in Belarus.
Yeah, in Belarus, and the headlines just out. John, why don't you go over those headlines? I think you've got an affinity with Ryanair that Lisa and I don't have. I mean, to say Ryanair's cooperating, that barely describes it, doesn't it?
And the EU leaders are going to have to respond to this. They meet today, Tom, and this is high up on the agenda, maybe the only issue on the agenda for much of that meeting.
I think for Americans, John, it's so important to just simply go back to first principles and get the map out, rather. Athens up to Latvia to Vilnius, and Minsk in Belarus between Russia and the Baltic states is 116 miles from Latvia. The closeness here and the proximity of these tensions can't be said enough. We've got Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, coming up.
Looking forward to that conversation, Tom, a little bit later this morning in about 10 minutes' time, I think. Lisa, Ryanair condemning the unlawful actions by Belarusian authorities.
Yeah, that's what I was actually looking at. Ryanair's Chief Executive Officer Michael O'Leary coming out and saying this was a case of state-sponsored hijacking. Not only are they cooperating, they've taken a stance. And meanwhile, this raises a lot of questions about additional sanctions, although it's hard to see how many more sanctions could be placed on Belarus. Certainly, Germany is coming out and saying that they don't want their planes flying over that nation.
Well, this is it, Lisa. Tom, you'd have to believe that Europe, the European Union, are about to declare that the use of that airspace is unsafe.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the sanctions, as Lisa alludes to, are already in place, but there's much more that can be done to just simply saying we're not going to fly over the nation. We need to see a solution. And here's the critical sentence, which certainly we're not expert on. And Russia has to step in here and find the boundaries and that ancient tension back to World War II.
All of this ahead of the president's first overseas trip. He comes to Europe next month. From New York is the price action this morning. Good morning. Up 21 on the S&P. We bounced back by 0.5%. That's the story.
Rocketing
the S&P
higher.
At 41.72. You could call it 41.73. In a bond market, yields unchanged, 160, 165. Some supply coming through the week, 2s, 5s, and 7s. Lisa, no doubt, will run you through that as the week progresses. And in the FX market, euro dollar, Lisa, 122.12. A slightly stronger, firmer euro in the mix today.
So, John, when are you going to start putting Bitcoin on your charts? Is that going to happen?
For the morning chart, for this one, for the morning board, no time soon.
Okay, all right, so that'll never be on perhaps his morning board.
It's a good question.
But honestly, this is a key question. At what point does this become a metric that people look at every single day and use to determine their market action? Certainly regulators, Fed officials, as well as the biggest investors look at it every day. And today, one thing that I'm looking at, 9 a.m., the Fed's Lael Brainerd is going to be speaking at the Consensus Crypto Asset Conference for 2021. Then at 9:30, Ray Dalio of Bridgewater also speaking at that conference. Very interested to hear about FedCoin, the idea of a digital dollar, which the Federal Reserve has taken more action in discussing. And Ray Dalio has come out with some skepticism about the crypto asset. Curious to see whether he's changed his views at all. 12 p.m. also on the financial services front, the House Committee for Financial Services holding a hearing on direct listings, SPACs, and public financing in a host of different ways, as well as investor protections. Very interested in another nugget of froth that people have identified in markets, how much they were going to reveal in terms of appetite by regulators to crack down. And then today, U.S. Secretary Gina Raimondo visits Micron Technology in Virginia, also accompanied by bipartisan Congress members, very interested to see whether the U.S. can actually make any measures to ignite semiconductor production in the United States, as we do see that ongoing chip shortage, John.
Lisa, thank you. Quote of the weekend ad on Twitter came from Jared Dillian, who writes for Bloomberg Opinion. Said the following, Tom. The nice thing about the stock market is that you stop getting your ass kicked at Friday at 4 p.m. and it generally doesn't ruin your weekend. I believe Jared was alluding to the fact that Bitcoin trades through the weekend, Tom. which brings a very different set of emotions Monday through Sunday instead of just Monday through Friday.
And to review, China with two statements over the last week, and you wonder what the next political statement will be to move out Bitcoin, or as Lisa puts up there, Ethereum as well. I'm less certain that it's linked to the market. I think it's almost just an item of interest, John, to so many removed from Bitcoin.
We'll touch on it a little bit later. I'm looking forward to catching up with Troy Gajewski of Skybridge at about 9 o'clock.
Oh, and your
Eastern
other property.
Time. Here's the quote from Mike Dada of MKM Partners. He says the following: although supply-side shocks are by their nature temporary, our view is that inflationary pressures are likely to persist if nominal aggregate demand continues to run at rates several orders of magnitude greater than any reasonable estimate of potential growth. Mike Dada joins us now. Mike, is that what you anticipate?
I do. Thanks for having me on. So we're going to get a GDP revision this week, and we've got nominal aggregate demand running at about 10% annualized rate. And the forecast as we move into Q2 is for that to continue. So that is not sustainable. It's okay for now because the economy's coming out of a deep hole. But the idea here is that the Fed is going to be behind the curve when they do start the tightening process. The intention is to wait until we're essentially fully recovered and inflation is somewhat above target before they even get going on monetary tightening. And that's quite different from what happened in the past. So the risk is that there is some overshoot of potential and that these inflationary pressures prove to be a bit more persistent maybe than some officials are out there making them to be.
I mean, Michael Daugherty, you're one of the leading proponents of watching nominal GDP, the behavior of nominal GDP itself. As you say in your note, that is the real economy with the overlay of inflation on top. If and when the Fed tightens, what is affected first, inflation or the real economy?
Well, Tom, asset markets will be impacted first. So we're watching a few variables in addition to the behavior of nominal GDP is a bit backward looking with the statistics that we get. But we can watch the inflation break-even market. That's been in a very steady upward ascent. It's recently pulled back just a touch, but if you look at the behavior of those inflation compensation spreads from March of last year, it's been an incredible V rebound. And we're watching the behavior of broad money growing very rapidly, much more rapidly than what we saw after the 07-09 crash. And so, those two variables and how they start to react once the Fed gets closer to either a taper or, after that down the road, rate hikes will be quite important to the nominal GDP outlook, in our opinion.
Mike, in the notes that I was reading over the weekend, there's increasing skepticism, frankly, over the inflationary theme that we keep hearing. And a part of it stems from efforts on the part of Chinese as well as others to crack down on commodity prices. And frankly, in China in particular, to reduce the amount of credit in the system. How does that play into your feeling, the idea that inflation is global and there are global inflation pressures to tamp down some of what we've seen that's generated these higher prices?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, China is using some blunt tools to try to address commodity price inflation. China was also the first into the COVID shock and has been the first out. And, we like to watch industrial metals just as a broad proxy for global industrial demand. And they've obviously been in a very steep ascent here. As long as the global economy continues to recover, and obviously we have Europe and certainly parts of Asia way behind where the U.S. and China are with the virus and the recovery. But as long as there is a global upswing taking shape, then that should be helpful for the commodity price backdrop. But it has been exaggerated, and these markets are subject to volatility and correction. So from an investing standpoint, probably a bit of a dangerous place to be right now.
Mike, just quickly, how useful is China's credit impulse as just a guide for the broader market? It used to tell you something about manufacturing, about metals. Does it anymore?
It's a great question. We watch it. We'll watch everything. I'm not sure that it's a perfect predictor of what's going to happen with commodity prices. Probably more coincidence, if anything.
Mike Dada, good to catch up. Joining us from MKM Partners, chief economist and market strategist on the latest in this market. A little bit lighter on economic data this week, going into next week when payrolls Friday is just coming up, just around the corner. We almost close out the month of May, going into a long weekend this coming weekend. The reaction has been swift. It's been hard, it's been fast, yet we are still waiting for actual additional sanctions to come from Europe to deal with the authorities in Belarus off the back of this grounded plane.
I'll give them some time. I'm surprised we haven't heard from more airlines. I did a quick search through the Bloomberg, which you can do, folks, with our headline service, and obviously Ryanair has come out with comments. You sort of wonder where the others are. Maybe they're waiting to see what the governments will do as well. John, what I would suggest here is May. There was a real ambivalence in the zeitgeist over the weekend about the quality of the American consumer in May. Maybe there's a little bit of an ebb. I'm very unsure on that.
What really gets me right now is the fact that this story is so well known. We had some blowout PMIs to close out last week. They were fantastic in the 60s for manufacturing, in the 70s for services. And you go through it line by line. Prices paid and received running at a record. New orders, the highest reading since the series began. It's a familiar story and you're bored of hearing it, and maybe there's some signal in the fact that you're bored of hearing it, Lisa, because this story is really well known now.
It is well known, but here are the unknowns, and this is what I'm looking for. One of them is how much of the higher prices that we're seeing are directly tied to commodities that could potentially be temporary. And the second thing is, why exactly is this shortage of labor persisting? We don't understand that exactly. People point to a number of different variables here, but the answer to this question will determine whether wages can really increase substantially, and that will really be the predictor of sustained inflation, John.
We'll get the answer to that deeper through summer.
Yes,
Would
correct.
you expect closer to the end of August, start of September?
Yeah, but until we get that, there's so many unknowns that people look at this, and yes, they tell a story, but it's unclear whether that story will hold true.
Yeah.
Crushed on the S&P right now, Tom.
Just it is from the high, the futures from the top down 1.3%.
Was it?
You've been practicing
I saw so much gloom this weekend.
Whole
John,
weekend, look it in the mirror.
We're down 1.3%. The pendulum of gloom is a fiction.
You two are like fighting.
Pendulum of
past me this
gloom.
morning. Equities up 0.5%, up 21 on the S&P 500. Coming up, a conversation you do not want to miss. At 7 a.m., Carl Bildt, the European Council on Foreign Relations co-chair from New York. This is Bloomberg.
With the First Word News, I'm Rishka Gupta. Flights are being redirected to avoid Belarusian airspace after the government in Minsk forced a Ryanair plane to land and arrested a journalist on board. The European Union will consider further sanctions against Belarus when its leaders meet in Brussels tonight for the start of a two-day summit. Bloomberg has learned potential measures could include suspending flights over Belarus and banning the country's national airline from landing at EU airports. China is accusing the U.S. of promoting theories that the coronavirus escaped from a high-security lab in Wuhan. China responded today to a new report about sick workers at the facility. The lab has repeatedly denied these claims, including a U.S. State Department report that some researchers became ill as early as the fall of 2019. China calls the claims conspiracy theories created to divert attention from the U.S. government's own handling of the coronavirus. There are signs that new cases of COVID-19 in India are easing, but the country's death toll continues to spike. India reported more than 222,000 new coronavirus infections today. That's the lowest since April 16th. While cases may have peaked, COVID-19 has now killed more than 300,000 people in India. Almost 4,500 people died over the past 24 hours, and fatalities continue at near record levels. And a progressive group has started a campaign to pressure a sitting Supreme Court justice to retire so a Democratic president can replace him. Activists in the group Demand Justice are behind the Breyer Retire campaign, calling for 82-year-old Justice Stephen Breyer to step down. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take. Powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts, I'm Rishka Gupta. This is Bloomberg.
we're now in the early stages of a sustainability revolution.
The battery problem may be the biggest unsolved problem in all of technology.
Every time the United States has done great transformative things, there's been a partnership between government and the private sector.
With a willing partner to ensure competitiveness and draw in investment in the United States, Canada's going to be able to be even more ambitious.
The objective for Glasgow, first and foremost, is to keep that 1.5 degree temperature rise within reach.
The train has left the station. Investors care about it. People who work inside of corporate America care about these issues. And certainly we see that with just the broader community.
There's not enough tax in the world for private sector to pay for all of this. It's going to have to be a public-private partnership.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Right now, about half of U.S. households invest. We'd like to get that number up to 95+%. Investing should be as ubiquitous as shopping online. It should just be something that people do.
From New York City this morning, good morning. Alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz, I'm Jonathan Ferro. Monday morning, and here's the price action on the S&P 500, 41.73, bouncing back 21 points on the S&P, taking a bite out of last week's loss. We're up 0.5%. In the bond market, yields basically unchanged at 161.65. In foreign exchange, euro stronger, euro dollar 122.16, up about 1/3%. And just to round things out quickly, because we need to get to some news, 64.85 on WTI, called it 83, up about 2 percentage points there. The Irish Prime Minister, Tom, with some strong words a couple of hours ago, calling the forced landing of the Ryanair flight an act of piracy. Now, it's just going to be very interesting to me how we get from this strong rhetoric to sanctions that match that rhetoric, given that this is a country that is already heavily sanctioned.
Our team's been working on it through the weekend here. We're scheduled to be with the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, and we're trying to link up with him now. Our Maria Tadeo in Brussels following this story as well. It may be range-bound on the screen, but the political range of Europe has changed. Martin Schenker is our editor-at-large in charge of all of our political coverage. All of a sudden, Marty, when the facts change, President Biden will change. Suddenly, it will be a very different European trip.
It certainly will. This is, I've been doing this for quite a long time. It's one of the most bizarre stories that I've seen in quite a while.
And it's got to be the idea of a Russian response. If we're dealing with a guy who's predictable in his unpredictability, I think we've all observed that. Minsk's only 116 miles from the Baltic states and the Baltic border. Fine, but it is Moscow that will have to adapt and adjust.
Yeah, and, Joe Biden has keeps saying that he's looking forward to his meeting with Vladimir Putin. That hasn't been set in stone yet. We expect it to happen pretty soon. But that conversation is going to take on a new sense of urgency because of what happened this weekend.
Marty, what on earth can we expect from that meeting? It's like living in an alternative universe. When you hear what the Europeans have got to say, and then you hear Russia's response to this, the foreign ministry reportedly calling the Western reaction to the Ryanair incident as shocking. They've been accused by Belarus of trying to politicize the event. How do you have a conversation with someone on the other side of a table that sees a completely different world to the one you see?
Yeah, and it's not unprecedented. I mean, when Vladimir Putin was asked about Russian interference in elections, he just said, well, it didn't happen. And that's his reality. Whether it's true or not is sort of not important to him. He just wants to make sure that he keeps the West on edge, and he's doing just that.
So what's the U.S. response going to be? We've heard from certain European countries, including Germany, with respect to the airspace over Belarus. Is the U.S. expected to come out with something stronger than perhaps just additional sanctions in an already heavily sanctioned country, as John mentioned?
Yeah, Lisa, it's kind of hard to imagine what more we can do to sanction Belarus. And the other factor here is there is a pro-democracy movement in Belarus. If you completely isolate them, you're also isolating that movement. So they have to be very careful about how they respond.
And this is actually somewhat parallel, at least in that manner, to Iran, because for a while, the Iranian response to the government had been an increasingly democratic one, at least among the populace. And then when the U.S. cracked down, that became more complicated. Now we're getting word from Tony Blinken and others that they want to see a return to the Iranian nuclear agreement that we had before. What's the progress going to be on that?
Well, I do think that that they are interested in getting Iran back into the nuclear accord, and on Iran's part, they certainly would like the sanctions to be eased. That'll have implications for oil more than anything else in terms of the supply that will be put back into the marketplace if Iran sanctions are lifted.
Open question. What are you watching in Washington this week? We sort of stumbled. One of the news items, maybe Bloomberg, I can't remember, talked about infrastructure, can't find the bridge to the other side. What in Washington captures your attention this week?
We have a story this morning about how Democrats are becoming increasingly uneasy over Joe Biden's tax plans. That balanced with some attempt to do a deal on infrastructure this week with the Republicans, it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out.
The heart of the matter, given the politics we all know was dealt the first Tuesday of November last year, he doesn't have the votes, right?
Well, it's not clear if he has the votes. Look, the one thing that Biden has said is inaction is not acceptable. So he will twist arms. He'll somehow manage to get something done on taxes and infrastructure, in my opinion.
Marty, it makes me wonder where we've seen progress over the last couple of weeks. We had Senator Susan Collins, the Republican from Maine, speaking to ABC over the weekend on the scope of the bill. And just one line, one question, I think, gets everyone's attention. What is infrastructure? Marty, they're still having that conversation.
Right.
So what kind of progress have we made over the last several weeks?
Well, I do think that there is an agreement on what traditional infrastructure is, and that the Republicans are willing to go there if Joe Biden is willing to go there as well. But it's all that soft infrastructure stuff that the Republicans don't want any part of. But I do think Joe Biden will reach some deal with the Republicans.
Can we wrap things up, Marty, by talking about Big Phil getting it done over the weekend? Mickelson, how romantic was that to see Phil Mickelson come back and win another major?
Yeah, I mean, you know, they talk about Phil Mickelson being 50 years old. To me, that's a young man, not an old man. But it is extraordinary. You also had Tom Brady, the oldest quarterback to win a Super Bowl this year. So it's been the senior moment.
I remember the senior moment where the skates said, I said go, and the skates said no.
Yes.
I mean, I remember that moment. I believe it was in the vicinity of 42 in my amateur state. Putting at that level at age 50?
It's pretty good. But you also remember Gordie Howe, right? He played hockey when he was 50 years old.
What we would do, Tom, Marty, what we would do to see Tiger and Phil together again in a major playing golf, wouldn't that be something?
That would be good.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Remains to be seen whether Tiger's going to golf again.
Is this a sports report, John?
No, I just thought we should get Phil Mickelson in.
Well, I thought Gareth.
Just,
I mean,
it's the right thing to do.
You know, I mean, I look at what we've got going. I mean, Gareth.
I was waiting for that.
I was waiting for that. He steps on the field and good things happen. I deliberately started this
conversation a little bit earlier so that we could talk about your tots, making it happen. You'll be playing on Thursday nights. Guess who'll be playing on Tuesday and Wednesday nights? AC Milan, back in a Champions League.
Yeah, well, they're not. But I just, this old thing of Gareth Bale or Phil Mickelson, I mean, they both delivered in spades.
Yeah, Gareth is a little bit younger, to be honest.
Yeah,
Tom.
but in that game, I mean, he's up against 20-year-olds.
You certainly don't get it done in football at 50 years old.
Yeah.
He's just trying to come up with a segue. Come on. A segui, excuse me. It's like both of them won. Both of them were there. Yeah, a segui.
We're doing golf because I think the majority of our audience are probably interested in who won the golf over the weekend.
Did you actually watch it, John?
I watched a bit of it, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Tom, did you watch it?
Sunday. I usually watch the fourth round.
Watching Red Sox
I watched
Padres.
the final round. I've seen your Padres T-shirts, Tom. I really don't know what I think of this.
They're destined. I mean,
They're destined.
It's fun.
What
I mean,
happened
the
to the
three
Red
best
Sox?
teams in baseball are all out on the West Coast.
Okay.
Red Sox are such piety for his life. He can't even talk about it.
No idea.
I got
Coming
some
up,
hate mail.
Margaret Patel, Wells Fargo Asset Management Senior Portfolio Manager. Looking forward to that conversation. Going into that, bond yields unchanged.
Some more tang.
161.82. Equity futures up 21. We advance 0.5%. 41.73. From New York City, this is Bloomberg.
Lumber prices across the U.S. are skyrocketing. A 60% surge this year sent prices to a record. And analysts, they aren't expecting any relief until late 2021.
If you can get your hands on it, you're going to buy it, no matter what the number is. And the numbers are getting higher and higher.
Tightness is acute across the entire timber supply chain. Sawmills have had trouble ramping up fast enough to meet demand, while trucking delays and worker shortages at lumber yards have added to the cost. The summer peak of U.S. home building is expected to deepen these supply constraints and keep home prices red hot.
What's happening is lumber's going up, insulation's going up, stucco's going up, concrete's going up, and that's getting passed on to the consumer.
According to the National Association of Home Builders, wood costs have already added more than $24,000 to the price of the average new house. Lumber prices are expected to stay elevated for months to come.
BSO Now is your online home for brand new Boston Symphony Orchestra and Boston Pops performances. Discover new releases each week that include behind-the-scenes storytelling with conductors including music director Andres Nelsons, guest composers and musicians, plus critically acclaimed archival concerts and more. Visit bso.org/now, where the music plays on. BSO season sponsored by Bank of America.
Expect clear, concise conversation on Bloomberg Surveillance.
There's no vowels in a digital future.
Come on, John, I just think it works.
It works. For Umbertus.
We've beaten this to death.
Watch weekday mornings on Bloomberg Television.
Monday morning, here's the price action. Good morning to you all. Equity futures up about 21 points on the S&P. We advance 0.5%, advancing 0.6% on the Nasdaq. Some relative outperformance on a tech-heavy Nasdaq 100, a story we've got familiar with over the past week. We bounced back from a week of losses with a small morning of gains. If we switch up the board, into the bond market we go. Ton of Fed speak through today. Governor Brainerd, then we've got Mester, Bostic, George as well on deck as well. So you hear from some Fed presidents too. Going into that yield, it's unchanged at 161.65 on 10s, on 30s, 231.62. That's the Fed speak. Got to talk about the supply as well. 2s, 5s, and the dreaded 7s coming later on this week. We'll talk to Marky Patel, Lisa, about that in just a moment. We need some music to go with the dreaded 7s. We'll do that through the week. Switch up the board and finish on euro dollar. Just want to finish on this. Kick Duke's out this morning, calling it a stalemate for euro dollar. Euro dollar right now.
Well said.
122.14. Well said, Kit Jukes of SocGen. We're up about 1/3 here, Tom. Stronger euro in the mix with a 122 handle again.
And that really, a stalemate really colors the market here in equities, bonds, currencies, commodities. It's just a churn out there. You're looking for what way to go. The one exception maybe would be green on the screen and equities higher as well. Marty Patel is with us right now. A short visit with Wells Fargo Asset Management. Margie, I'm absolutely fascinated by taking the middle ground in this time of polarity of cyclicals versus tech and the rest of it. What is it like managing a diversified portfolio to a middle and balanced outcome?
Well, it looks right now as if I think over the next year, growth from all asset classes are going to be pretty muted. Stocks maybe mid-single digit, high single digit, and with bonds really mid to low single digits. So we're looking for pretty much muted return, and a lot of the volatility we're seeing we think is just short-term meaningless churning and not really giving you insight into where the market's going to head.
Marky, when you look through the bond yield curve, 2s out to 30s, what I've identified every time we get a data miss, a data surprise to the upside, to the downside, seem to get a lot more movement in the belly of the curve, 5s in and around 7s too. Why is that, Marky? What's the dynamic at play there that there seems to be a big debate on any given data point?
Well, I think because the short end and the long end are both really controlled by the Fed. So the only way you can really express a trading position is in the middle part of the curve. And that's why you see, I particularly like the 10-year because it's now a great sentiment indicator reacting to numbers over the short term, although it's still in the whole middle of the curve, stuck in a trading range.
How would you express that move in the middle of the curve right now then, Marky? How would you express a trade?
Well, I think we're still stuck in the middle of this. I think the market goes up to the top end of the curve when there's maybe negative sentiment, and then they swing back to the lower end or right around where we are now, 1.5 or what around 160. So I don't think those rates are going anywhere. I think the Fed has been very clear that they're not going to allow any part of the curve to really get away from them.
Just to channel Margie, Tom Keene, that's the full faith and credit story. What about the credit story, the corporate debt story? We've seen Morgan Stanley come out recently and downgrade their expectations for corporate credit to neutral because they think that it is priced to perfection in a world with rising rates potentially, as well as perhaps peak growth rates already seen in the recovery.
The peak growth rate, I would definitely agree in. As far as rising rates as a secular trend, I absolutely don't see it. I think we're still stuck in more or less a trading range for the foreseeable future. And it's true, you could say bonds are priced for perfection, but in a way, the world looks pretty perfect. We should have continued economic growth. We should have defaults being very low. Corporations, especially in the U.S., are in great shape. So I don't think you can expect a big rise in defaults, a big jump in volatility. I think it's pretty much more of the same.
What is the least priced in scenario, Margie? And I ask this ahead of Matt Hornbach of Morgan Stanley, who will be on this show talking about how so much inflation has been built in that a lowflation, a disinflation environment potentially could be one of the bigger risks. What's your view on this?
I think rates are more likely to go lower rather than upper. I don't buy into the inflation story. It would be great. We all know what to do as investors, look at the history books, but I just don't think that's going to happen. I think we have this push up temporarily, then I think it's going to fade as we see growth fade, still positive in the second half of the year.
Margie, what do you see in conservative stocks when you combine dividend growth with share buyback? Is it traceable, or is it such a one-off right now in a boom economy you can't really develop a trend?
Well, I think you really have to look at industries and company results. I don't think you can really play some of these themes, value growth and so forth. So we try to look for companies that still should have sustainable growth, hopefully better than the economy, better than the average stock, and take the dividend where it comes, whether it's high or low, but rather look at the companies, because dividends are still pretty low. Standard & Poor's is less than 1.4, so you're not going to get a big party return from dividends anyway.
Are you husbanding cash right now?
No, because I see very low risk in the sense of a big drop in the equity market or a big drop in bond prices, a spike up in yield. So we think you just have to take the market as it comes and sort of look for the best in the bond market, look for the where you can do the best in the equities, and basically stay fully invested. We think the Fed has pretty much told us we aren't going to have any big volatility in the financial markets. They're going to assure us of that, I believe.
Margie, thank you. We've got to run. Margie Vitale there, Wells Fargo Asset Management Senior Portfolio Manager. We have to run because we have to find some space to do this, TK. I wasn't aware, otherwise I would have done it earlier. Congratulations to Lisa Abramowitz, who is the proud recipient of a Gracie Award from the Alliance for Women in Media. Lisa winning for her work on the Bloomberg radio special, Generation Interrupted. Lisa, congratulations.
Thank you.
Sterling
I really
work.
appreciate
Fantastic.
it. I'm glad you didn't do it earlier because there's plenty else going on in the world.
Well, we waited 36 minutes.
One thing I will say is that on this show and all of the shows on Bloomberg, we've done a really good job of trying to highlight all of the ramifications, which we really won't know for a very long time from the COVID pandemic.
What did we learn on Generation Interrupted, Lisa? And what are we learning since that was published?
Well, it was taking a look at the younger generations, those in school, both, education in the primary grades as well as college and just after, and how the disruption to their career trajectories could have a pretty big impact on their longer-term earnings potential, in addition to social development, and how this is a big concern for economists.
Very cool. TK.
Thanks.
In the presence of greatness.
We are.
With Lisa Abramowitz this morning.
Let's not get carried away.
Well done, Lisa. Well done.
Thank you.
Very good. Right now, with what we observed over the weekend, our team has worked overnight to find the right voices to describe the geography of Europe and the politics of Europe. We start strong on this Monday with Carl Bildt. He's a former Prime Minister of Sweden, for an extended time, their Minister of Foreign Affairs. But far more than that, he has applied his public life to the fractured continent, moving from Athens up to Vilnius. His work in Kosovo, his work in all of the Balkan states as well is noted. He is European Council on Foreign Relations co-chair. Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us today. There has to be a response, less with the original assertive Belarus and far more from Moscow. What can Europe and European political leaders ask of Mr. Putin this morning?
Well, I mean, you're entirely right. There has to be a very firm answer. This is air piracy. This is banditry in airspace. And if this is tolerated by Lukashenko, it could happen everywhere in the world. So it's a threat to to the safety and security of global airspace everywhere. So firm action has to be taken. What can be done? Well, I mean, European leaders are meeting this evening in Brussels planned for other issues, needless to say. I think they should declare Belarus airspace unsafe. One should not fly through Belarus airspace because you might be subject to hijacking, or God knows what this man is capable of doing. And then, of course, bring it up in the relevant international bodies, ICAO, and probably see what can be done within that context. There might also be a case for wider economic and financial sanctions against Belarus if he doesn't follow the international reaction now. Russia will be supporting of Belarus in this particular action. Right. I don't think that particular thing is nice, but they will be supporting Belarus, yes.
Carl Bildt, you wrote an essay for Foreign Affairs. I'm going to play off of it years ago, in that this event will reveal Belarus. This event will reveal Russia as they treat the Baltic states. We forget these distances, 116 miles from Minsk to Vilnius. It's an hour and 30-minute flight to Stockholm. Describe the closenesses here of the tension, the geography of the tension, along with what this will reveal about these two states.
No, it's very true. Minsk and Vilnius are very close. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the statistics, Belarus is the country in all of the world where you have the highest numbers of Schengen visas relationship to the population. Because Belarus people are normal Europeans. They like to go to shopping in Warsaw or in Vilnius or wherever. But they got this thug, Lukashenko, who's been there forever since the fall of the Soviet Union. And he's been able to consolidate an authoritarian regime. The economy is a sort of Soviet memorial, more or less. I mean, it's dependent upon a couple of huge state-owned enterprises. The economy is miserable, all sorts of deficits. The Russians have to bail them out now and then. And of course, he completely manipulated an election last autumn. And since then, he's been trying to preserve his power by very severe repression against a very decent European nation, which, as you said, is close to us. I mean, Minsk is much closer to Stockholm than Brussels or London is. So it's not a faraway country of which we know nothing. It's nearby, and it concerns us.
Carl, this is the political dilemma, isn't it? How do you punish, how do you sanction the government without isolating the people? How do you do that? What kind of decisions do you make?
Yeah, and the dilemma has also been another one, if you look back on the discussions over the years. If we sanction heavily the Belarus economy, there's a risk of course, the Russians picking up the entire thing. Because Russia, Moscow, has been keen on integrating Belarus even more closely than is the case, and even taking over this particular Belarus enterprises. So that's been a consideration so far. In this particular case, so there's a downside to different sanctions. But I think in this particular case, what is done is so outrageous that the downside of doing nothing is far greater than the downside that is there of these particular sanctions, unfortunately, but that's the case.
Do you sense that Europe is united on how to respond to this?
Too early to tell. I mean, this happened literally hours ago. And I think prime ministers and presidents preparing to go to Brussels are still sort of discussing exactly what to do. But if I see what primarily Lithuania, which is most directly affected, are demanding, they are demanding the closing of Belarus airspace for EU flights. They are demanding the closure of EU airspace for the Belarus state airline. I think the Polish Prime Minister said something along those lines. There's a sort of fairly strong language coming out of Brussels, although no action as of yet. Tony Blinken, Washington has come out and said that the decision-making bodies of the International Civil Aviation Organization must be called in. I think they're still discussing exactly what can be done. This is a rather unique situation. There is no blueprint for how you do it. But I think there is, the Greek Prime Minister has to be said at somewhat greater distance in geography, but the flight that was hijacked was coming from Athens. The Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis has also been very strong in his language. So something will come out of it.
Carl, in the meantime, the Kremlin has said that this has not disrupted President Vladimir Putin's plan to meet with President Biden of the United States at the summit next month. What would you hope the U.S. response could be or would be to some of this? How much will the U.S., do you expect the U.S. to be working in tandem with Europeans as represented by yourself?
Well, I'm quite certain there will be close coordination across the Atlantic. There have been sort of a statement by Secretary Blinken. There was a very strong statement, by the way, coming out of Senator Menendez, who is sort of chairman of the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee, together with the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committees of the German Parliament and the UK Parliament and a couple of other parliaments. And they were calling for strong measures and they were calling for transatlantic coordination. I think that will happen. I think we'll see EU and the US working together, and the UK working together on this.
Carl, who is the center of power when it comes to determining the response of Europe to Belarus, as well as, frankly, to Russia, which seems to be supporting Belarus's actions?
I think it's going to be Brussels, also because of the fact that by coincidence, the heads of state and government are meeting in Brussels tonight, this evening, and tomorrow. So you'll have all of the decision-making power of the EU at one spot this evening and tomorrow. So that I think will be decisive. And then obviously talking to London, obviously talking to Washington.
I need to go back, Prime Minister, to the linkage here of Moscow and Minsk. I mean, obviously, we're going to treat Belarus separately here. There'll be outrage and action as well. How does NATO, how does Brussels link Moscow into their actions?
I think NATO will probably sort of stay on the sidelines. This is not a sort of a military issue, and I don't think we would like it to become a military issue either, by the way. But the role of Moscow is going to be important. I think it's important for Brussels and Washington to send a clear message to Russia that we see this as an infringement upon international rules that are of importance to Russia as well. And we would expect them to not necessarily support us. I don't think they will do that, but to stay calm when action is taken against Lukashenko.
Carl, we've got to leave it there. Fantastic to catch up with you, and what a morning for it. A story that is as much bizarre as it is serious, very much so. Carl Bildt, the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you, sir. The European Summit starting with a pre-summit at 3 p.m. Brussels time, whatever that is, Tom. And then a little bit later,
like
dinner kicking off
3 a.m.
at 7 p.m. Brussels, won the last 30 seconds. But to Carl's point, when I asked, is Europe united on how to respond to this, he said it's still early. The bottom line is, though, for the airlines, Tom, they've got to operate right now, this morning, through the day, and work out what to do with that airspace.
And Maria, today I was on this looking at the radar maps over Europe, and I've been searching on the Bloomberg for what Lufthansa does and British Air and others. I'm no expert at this as well, but I do agree, John, there's got to be an immediate response. How do you get on a plane and fly over Belarus right now?
No idea. With a lot of nervousness, I imagine. Let's reset. Let's get to the equity market. We look like this Monday morning on the S&P 500 up 19. We advance about 0.5%. Tom, yields unchanged, 161.65. Foreign exchange, Kit Jukes over at SocGen calling it a stalemate. Euro dollar 122.18. A stronger euro up about 1/3% there. And just to round things out, just short of a 65 handle on WTI at 64.79. TK, we advance there by about 1.9%.
And the American recovery advances as well. The pandemic weekend in this New York City was just extraordinary to see. There's just every moment nuances showing the opening of the city. We'll be speaking with one of the mayoral candidates here later this morning. With that, there were essays of what America should do. Joshua Sharfstein, who's at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, their vice dean, and Dr. Sharfstein joins us this morning. Joshua, Scott Galloway, a good friend of the program, had out an important essay this weekend about how the U.S. will project its vaccine excellence abroad. Do we have the supply of vaccines to meet our needs and at the same time really begin to distribute with force to troubled nations?
We can do a lot with the extra vaccines that we have, and we certainly have enough to meet our needs, but it's going to take even more than that because there are so many people in the world and so many people in countries like India where the virus is really running amok. So I think part of the answer is the U.S. manufacturing vaccines for the world, and the other part of the answer is the U.S. being a real team player in building production capacity across the world.
Do you see other nations looking at the best practices of the United Kingdom, New Zealand, the United States, and other nations that seem to have gotten this right? Are they learning from what we've done where they're rapidly catching up?
Well, I think, they may not see it that way. They may not see it as a best practice. They may see it as the United States has vaccines and we want vaccines. I think that certainly we have shown that the mRNA vaccines in the United States and other countries are very, very effective. And that's really what it's going to take to protect countries over the long term. So I think that's a very strong lesson for countries. Certainly the public health measures that countries put into place, and I'm thinking more maybe of some of the East Asian countries, New Zealand, because of its unique geography, had some advantages and has done a tremendous job. Taiwan, all those countries, those have different public health lessons. I think from the United States, it's the investment in vaccines, the ability to vaccinate. Other countries want to do that too.
Joshua, you mentioned India, and it's come out over the weekend that studies show that the main variant there, the B.1.167 variant that has been spreading very quickly, is potentially 50% more contagious than even the variant that really was first identified in the United Kingdom. What do you make of these studies?
Well, it's an explanation for why we have so many people sick so quickly in India, combined with the fact that they let their guard down and had these major gatherings. It's a toxic mix that gives you just this astonishingly terrible outbreak right now. There's also evidence that the vaccines do work against this variant, and I think it's even more important for us to really think about the global vaccine supply.
Well, and this raises a question for travel and travel bans, and we see increasingly this sort of patchwork of guidance, particularly in Europe, about countries that are or are not on fly zones and fly lists due to some of the variants. Do you think that this is the right way to go, given how it's been a patchwork of tracking these variants and how ultimately it really just comes down to getting vaccinated, getting fully inoculated, and then gradually adapting to a new life?
I don't think it's going to be really sustainable to be putting on and taking off lots of different travel restrictions, especially when the travel restrictions are so porous. I mean, often the travel restrictions don't apply to citizens of your own country, understandably, but then they certainly can get infected and bring the virus in. So I think that, vaccination, particularly with the evidence that the vaccination does work against variants, really has to be the bedrock of a control strategy.
We've got headlines, Joshua Sharfstein, coming out right now, and actually this came up with conversation this weekend. The idea of the overlay of pneumonia on all of this virus pain that we've had. Pneumonia is a bacterium, and of course COVID is a virus. The headline is Pfizer is studying a pneumococcal conjugate with COVID-19 booster. That's fascinating to me. Is the next step here some kind of virus-bacterium combination of a vaccine?
Well, I haven't read that, but I know not enough people are vaccinated against pneumococcus, and maybe it's a way to combine both. If you're interested in not dying of a lung disease, then getting both of those is a good thing. And so, I could see the logic. Obviously, there'll be some extra study needed to make sure that those both can be immunogenic if they're given at the same time.
What should our viewers and our listeners do if they observe cases coming down in the vicinity of 20,000, deaths per day well under 1,000 in America? How should we interpret that?
Well, just like the virus can go up exponentially, it can go down exponentially. We're on the best part of the curve right now as it's continuing to decline, and that makes everything that we're doing safer. It gives people more confidence in doing things they hadn't done before. That's all good. However, and I talked to Justin Lessler, a professor at the School of Public Health, about this last week. What modeling is consistently showing is that even though it's going to go down, it could well go up in the fall. And the single most important factor to keep us from another fall surge is the vaccination rate. So let's say the vaccination rate is 60%, 65%, and the cases are going down. That is not mission accomplished. If we can get it to 75, 80 before the fall, then we're really cutting off the ability of the virus to have a bigger surge in the fall.
Joshua, at the same time, there is a social implication from continuing some of the restrictions and social distancing. I was reading an article over the weekend about opioid overdoses and how they've skyrocketed over the past 14 months, people in isolation, drug abuse issues becoming even more prevalent. There is a health impact to continuing the social isolation by some of these policies. Is it time, as Amish Adalja has put out there, to start moving into a post-COVID world, a post-pandemic world, where COVID is just another virus that we deal with akin to the flu, and that people who have gotten vaccinated will be protected, and those who have not, it's their liability?
So 2 points. First of all, with respect to opioid overdoses and many of the consequences, I think it's a mistake to think of these as consequences of the response. We had a global pandemic that kept people, isolated, and that happened regardless of the response that was going to happen, or we were going to have incredible death rates from the virus. Now that that has gone down, absolutely there are new opportunities to provide treatment. My wife runs as a medical director of an addiction treatment program. They kept going and expanded different services during the pandemic, and it's really important for governments to turn their attention to this, for people to have the same urgency for that crisis that they had for COVID, and that will manifest itself in many ways, and it's very, very important right now. I think to Dr. Adalja's point, we are not there yet. If we can get vaccination rate up, we can have 30 or 70 deaths a week from COVID, which might be, a manageable amount, instead of 2,500. That's what the models show is possible by the fall. So, I am not ready, and I disagree with him. If what he is saying is that it's time for us to just, move on to other things, we need to keep our focus, vaccinate against COVID, and prevent a resurgence that could claim thousands and thousands of lives this fall.
Some division there. Joshua Shafstein, the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health Vice Dean. Thank you, sir. Just want to turn some research on the South Side. We have a move, a cut of Moffitt-Nathanson on Discovery, Tom, to neutral from buy from Moffitt-Nathanson. They say we give high marks to Discovery for the boldness of their action and the long-term value creation that could be HBO Max. It also appears likely the Discovery stock will be stuck over the near term.
Yeah, it's not a surprise at all to me to see them take it down to a neutral. Neutral's not sell.
It's not. In the middle, Tom, between buy and sell. Hold. Do nothing. Neutral.
Thank you, John.
Coming up, Matt Hornback. Neutral's not sell. Morgan Stanley's Matt
It's not
Hornback
their
up
single
shortly.
best idea.
I imagine it's not on their high conviction list.
High conviction.
Traffic. Okay. During the pandemic, no traffic. Okay. Where do you see the oil market in about 20 years or so? Non-existent.
I think what we've seen during this period of time is that communicating via video is not a fad. We are using it in all aspects of our lives, for work, for learning, for communicating, for staying in touch.
Our generation's biggest problem.
Climate change is happening.
And the world's most innovative solutions.
Transport, industry, buildings, electricity, all of those things.
Everything you need to know about our changing environment, the politics of global warming.
We can and we will deal with climate change.
In the fight against climate change, Bloomberg Green has you covered.
economists and everyone, companies are having a really difficult time keeping up with how fast fundamentals are improving.
What we're seeing in the U.S. is just a very rapid rebound in demand, and supply is taking a little bit of time to adjust.
If the economy stays as strong as it is, fueled by all of the stimulus that was put behind it, you get inflation.
We see a decent amount of risk that inflation could keep rising. It's already rising, but stay higher for longer.
The Fed's strategy at the moment is really focused on ambiguity.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Tom Keene, Jonathan Ferro, and Lisa Abramowitz.
From New York City for our audience worldwide, good morning, good morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance live on TV and radio alongside Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz. I'm Jonathan Ferro. Monday morning, equity futures up 0.5%. We advance 20 points on the S&P 500. And we begin with the most bizarre story yet incredibly serious. The United States calling for the immediate release of a journalist arrested after the forced grounding of a Ryanair flight in Belarus, Tom, under what is widely considered now to be under false pretenses.
And we did not consider this Friday. Our Guy Johnson and Maria Tadeo both watching Ryanair 3340. John, I know you've taken this numerous times from Cyprus up to Tallinn, Finland, and it has gone over Belarus airspace. It's now just on it's on the border of Latvia and Estonia where it will land. But that's what we've come down to, John. We're looking at the airspaces of Ukraine and to the north, Belarus.
And the next move from the EU, Tom, with that summit kicking off a little bit later this afternoon.
Yeah, well, the summit is a key deal. But again, I go back to what we did with the former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt. I want to know what the reaction is to Moscow as much as I want to know the reaction to Minsk.
You alluded to this question, Lisa. How do you punish the government without